Welcome to this in brief description of a practicum focused on how to construct a diagnosis from a picture like this, presented in 3 parts. And as we move forward, we develop a terminology in the proper context. Within the very first part, the terminology will grow to this array and will continue growing through the second and third part. In the first part, we introduce the necessary concepts regarding the construction of a diagnosis, its components, the syndrome, notions of pathogenesis, etiology, and finally a synthesis, the diagnosis. So in essence, the presentations by OmniNet MedWord aim to combine presentations of visual signs with verbal expressions, medical terminology, and everything in between, stories, mythology, and so forth, to facilitate broad comprehension and easier memorization. In part two, we focus on sign signals and their synthesis. The prototype here is this image of a child that is very accurately represented. And we know that because Albrecht Dürer has the reputation to have been a very punctilious and accurate painter interested in human nature. He painted, for instance, this emperor. And if you like to know about the history of this face and faces, there is a video about it. This is the Habsburg family. Along the way, we emphasize two particular aspects that often are neglected: attention to symmetry and proportions. This proportion, that means altered morphogenesis, is the core of dysmorphogenesis. And this whole process requires that the clinician be curious. And clinicians tend to lose curiosity if they feel incompetent from engaging in such a process. Later on, then there is a step-by-step description how to build facts toward a diagnosis, how to start with signs, move to signals, then go into the context, clinical investigation. So all of this then is a synthesis that very often must start with notions of pathogenesis, then attribute the pathogenesis to a cause or etiology, and then come up with potential diagnoses. That is not one, but several. That is differential diagnosis. So in the synthesis, then, of course, we put all of these elements, they're discussed repeatedly. But the differential diagnosis, importance of it cannot be overemphasized. And then one more element, natural history, that requires attention. It is very often considered an old-fashioned notion, but it isn't. It is everything that pertains a particular patient in the broadest sense. Reminders all along the way is that diagnoses are hypothetical, they are not facts, and that they may require updates since they are hypothetical. New facts change the hypothesis. Final part, we move into the synthesis of the diagnosis, a hypothetical process through the pathway of pathogenesis and etiology. And we remind viewers that being aware of part A and B will increase the scope of understanding and ease memorization. So after a review of which signs are signals, then we need to put these signals into perspective. For instance, macrocephaly with macrocephaly, or squint or strabismus with other forms of strabismus. The more we know about each signal, the greater the differential diagnosis. And as we expand the list of signs that become signals, we finally will exhaust this approach. And as we increase the differential diagnosis, the number of signs will decrease the most likely and finally come up with the final diagnosis. In other words, each of these increases the perspective, but the more we add, shrinks the perspective of what is the actual diagnosis. So steps A, signs, step B, signals, they're discussed in detail, but then the most important one is the casuistics. How do we fit what we see into what has been seen the world over? Do they combine? Do they have a relationship? Otherwise, we are dealing with a de novo observation, and those are exotically rare. So, as we do the review of casuistics, we find, for instance, this report about 100 years ago. But this legacy was given 500 years ago, and yet they're very alike. And the alikeness are highlighted in the discussion. Of course, experience and knowledge contribute greatly toward the ability of properly using casuistics to build up a diagnosis. Amateurs should not attempt to make diagnosis. And from the casuistics, going from 1500 to 1900 to the current millennium, points out that there is a cluster of patients that are generally young children that often occur in endemic fashion, that is, clusters epidemiologically speaking, that the disorder is fatal in most instances and develops very gradually, and that the complications of this disorder or manifestations are hydrocephalus and strabismus, and these two exactly have that. And then a peculiar combination that while the legs are stiff, the neck is not. So after this trip from 1500 to 2021, we can see that facts remain facts. They don't change. Interpretation changes, and they change on the basis of how much we know concerning clinical medicine. And there is a beautiful review. So when we propose a diagnosis, we need to back it up. And here's a publication. And of course, you have to see the full video, or else I would remove the surprise of what is the diagnosis I consider to be rather strongly likely. So please view the full version, or you can try to read this. I left it so that if you augment the screen, you may be able to read what's written. So before we conclude, I have to call your attention that across these presentations, we touched upon a very broad and very important medical terminology. You can find short and memorable definitions about these notions in Pandora Wordbox, our companion website, and all the links are there in the MedWord website. Of course, to do this goal, that is, present medical terminology illuminations with clinical sense and sensitivity, and in the sphere of this morphology, that is, teratology, embryology, and clinical genetics, it requires many types of formats. Again, if you like to know what kind of formats and their rationale, you can go to MedWord companion website, and all of that is explained there. So now it's time for me to say goodbye. Thank you for your attention. I hope you visit us soon, and please accept my best wishes.